Aotearoa, or Land of the Long White Cloud. New Zealand remained unsettled for many thousands of years. The first people to come here at the end of the 12th century were the ancestors of the Maori. 500 years later, New Zealand was sighted again, this time by Europeans. First Abel Tasman and later James Cook. Two discoveries, two migrations, two destinies. Separate ancestors who explored a faraway land and had to learn to live together. It's a traditional Maori welcome. First they intimidate me, then they show goodwill and lay down a small branch. I take it and they'll go. This is how the Maori used to challenge all guests to see if they came in peace or otherwise. Of course I'll pick up the branch. Why make war? Let's negotiate. The Maori are masters here. However, they only came to New Zealand 5 centuries before the Europeans. Where they came from, no one knows.
We believe that we come from the uppermost heavens. We have a saying called, and we believe that the process of being born, of being conceived, is that we come from the heavens. In the spiritual realm. In the physical realm, we come from a place called Havaiki, in the Polynesian area, and we travelled here via our war canoes.
Havaiki isn't a geographical name. It comes from ancient myths and legends and isn't tied to a specific location. Polynesia is made up of more than 1,000 islands scattered over the central and southern Pacific Ocean. They're inhabited by dozens of peoples. Which of them was the legendary Havaiki?
My name's John. It's pretty easy on the waka. We've got a few rules. I tell everybody we have 3 rules. Don't fall off, don't fall off, and don't fall off. Alright? It's pretty easy.
There are in New Zealand as many boats and yachts as there are people. However, this boat, or waka as the Maori call it, is no ordinary boat. It was these canoes that once brought the Maori ancestors here to New Zealand.
It is a traditional Polynesian voyaging canoe, one of many designs. Traditionally, they had the double-hulled voyaging canoes for crossing the oceans, and it is thought that these were the style vessels, right down to almost the exact same size. Some of the older traditional wakas were a little bigger, were a bit smaller.
In another 10 minutes, the canoe will sail to Auckland Bay. The guests will have the unique opportunity to try their hands at steering.
Keep going. Get us back to the...
I seem to be moving back and forwards.
Yeah. Because that's how it happens in the sea. So you must counter that, eh?
It's like Maori pulling it.
That's exactly it.
While some learn to direct the boat, others hear how ancient sailors navigated the boundless ocean.
Far away, a frigate bird. If you see a frigate bird flying around in a big circle, you know there's land over there. So you could see, it could be way down below the horizon.
Right.
But you'd know by seeing those birds that that's land.
Teatorangi lives in Gisborne. Along with a team of like-minded colleagues, he's built a boat very much like the ancient Polynesian canoe.
When our ancestors built these types of canoes, they built them out of stone tools, using stone tools and wood from the islands. And to build a watercraft using stone tools and to make them watertight is really exceptional. Very intelligent, very scientific, and the engineering that goes into it is very, very precise, because you have to make several pieces of timber form together, pull together, and be lashed together, and make it high enough so that it's ocean worthy.
What prompted Teatorangi's ancestors to set out on such a long voyage over the ocean? There is no precise answer.
We think about resources and such as, enough space to live on, food, materials for building houses and canoes and all those kind of things. Islands, small islands out in the Pacific aren't that able to sustain quite large populations, and so those kinds of pressures, as well as some political pressures that were taking place.
And our ancestors built double-hulled voyaging canoes for a number of reasons. One of the main reasons is that they're more stable, and you can take a lot more people on board. If you want to migrate, if you're migrating a whole village, for example, and they may be 100 people, well then you need to have a big surface, a big deck space, in order for those people to actually to be able to fit.
The people took domestic fowl and animals with them, chickens, pigs and dogs. However, only the dogs made it to New Zealand. Rats too, though they weren't wanted. The other animals perished on the way. That's why, unlike other Polynesians, the Maori had no pigs or chickens. 7 boats came to New Zealand, or Aotearoa, the land of the long white cloud. Those 7 boats made up 7 tribes. The Maori language uses the same word for boat and tribe. More boats, meaning more tribes, arrived later. And New Zealand now has about 70 boat tribes. The modern Maori respect what their ancestors did. Having crossed the ocean, their challenge was to start again from scratch. in a land where no man had lived before.
I believe that my ancestors came out here from Havaiki many generations ago. My ancestors came on the Te Arawa canoe. We came on a double-hull canoe, and we used the stars, the sea, the birds as a way of coming to New Zealand.
The word "we" is no slip of the tongue. For Jenny, those bygone events of history are as real as everyday life. The coastal areas were occupied, so her ancestors made their way deeper into the country, to the land of lakes.
But in the Lakes region, they also came across some really harsh weather, and it was after 2 seasons they then decided to come inland to the hot water, mainly because they could lay their mats over the hot rocks and build their houses over it. They also could bathe in the hot pools, and they could also cook in the pools as well.
This area is very sacred, it's very spiritual. This is actually a place where our ancestors occupied, they grew up and occupied this land. And you will see throughout your time here, you'll see the puna, which is the sacred spring. And that is a primary reason as to why our people actually set up and lived here at the foot of Mount Nongataha.
That sacred place was not forgotten. The local Maori community built a large ethnographic centre in Rotorua, which offers an introduction to ancient Maori culture. Here in the bush, that New Zealanders called the land of native trees, an authentic Maori village is hidden.
Carvings like this would be placed at the entrance or at the exit of most villages. It was here to scare off the enemy mainly, but traditionally they were placed on palisades because the body, the head is a sacred part of Maori, and so if you were killed in battle, the enemy would cut your head off, and then they would place them on the palisades and taunt the tribe from which you came from.
Unlike other Polynesians, the Maori built fortified villages with palisades. They called those villages pa, and built them to defend the tribe against enemies.
So we were fortunate in the sense of being able to become custodians of this whenua, of this land, and to be able to share the stories, share the history, walk in the footsteps of our ancestors, and and share the wairua, the spirit of our people here.
Maori villages were often built in levels. The lower levels were for defenders. If a watchman spotted an enemy, he'd blow a conch shell, and the warriors would take to the perimeter defences, while the women and children remained on the higher levels.
Have a look at this little door. This house was specifically built for our warriors to arm themselves. If they were under attack and an attacking warrior then came to the door, he would have to crouch down and crawl through. Also, it was only large enough for one warrior to get through, not two. He would be waiting on the other side, ready to hit them on the head.
Though the vegetation is abundant, the native forests of New Zealand have few trees bearing edible fruit. The local wildlife offers little to eat too. Before man came here, the island had no predators or large animals at all. The ancient Maori faced a problem: what to live on. The tribes who lived near the ocean subsisted on seafood gathered at low tide, and fish.
So my ancestors were hunters and gatherers, and back in the days they would hang the food that they gathered, like eels and fish, on the hanging racks back there. They would also catch their eels, the eels and the crayfish, in those hinakis, we call them. They're not unlike, cray pots from the European countries, but they would put dead bracken in there, and then they would possibly put a rotting bird to attract the eels. The eels would then, they would glide into the hinaki, and then they wouldn't be able to get out.
The tribes who made their way deeper into the island had to look for other food sources. Eventually they found them. Long ago, moa, gigantic wingless birds, lived in New Zealand. The Maori used a ruse to catch them. They set fire to the forest, and according to scientists, the birds didn't try to run away, but sat down and tried to bury their heads in the sand. The hunters would simply beat them to death with sticks. A single moa provided a lot of meat, so the Maori hunted them eagerly. By the 17th century, they had been hunted to extinction. Fortunately, the moa's close relative, the famous kiwi bird, has survived. The giant dome is Otorohonga's main attraction. At the very top, the familiar silhouette of a bird with a long beak can be seen. The kiwi.
Now kiwi are very unique because technically they actually have more characteristics of a mammal, not a bird. So some of the interesting characteristics are the fact that they do have wings. A lot of people think they're flightless, but they do have wings. They're about 3 centimetres long, kind of the size of your little finger curled over.
Today, the kiwi is New Zealand's mascot. Kiwis are everywhere, on gifts, t-shirts and buildings. However, it's not that easy to see a live one.
Interesting characteristic about kiwi, of course, is that they're nocturnal. So kiwi are only active at night time. They do sleep during the day, but they're actually very inactive. So, you know, kiwi can be known to sleep up to 18 to 20 hours every day. So they spend a lot of their time doing that, and it is a pretty good life, really.
Kiwis know how to defend themselves. This is how a kiwi attacks a trespasser. At the same time, kiwis in the wild are very vulnerable. For many years, people hunted kiwis, bringing the species to the brink of extinction. Now there are 16 kiwi sanctuaries in New Zealand. They're trying to increase the kiwi population, raising chicks and releasing them into the wild.
You know, back in the day they did have deforestation, which did destroy their habitats. They were killed for their feathers and that type of thing, and probably eaten back then. And now, of course, predators are the main concern for kiwi, but a lot of New Zealanders now have called on to the conservation field, and they're doing a lot for kiwi. So there's a lot of programs out there that help them. So kiwi are very important to New Zealanders, of course, and I think that's because kiwi are quite unique. They're not found anywhere else. They're very, very, very strange birds, and the people of New Zealand are very proud of them.
Fish, seashells and game are what the Maori took from nature. However, they grew their own food staples. For a closer look, we went to the famous Hamilton Gardens. In the 1920s, a city administrator thought, we have no places of interest here, but it would be nice if we did. So let's make a wonderful garden which will represent the greatest cultures of all time. Ancient Rome, China, Japan, and so on. For some 80, or we'd say 90 years now, this garden has grown and become more and more beautiful. The city now has its own place of interest. Tourists travel just to see the garden. Wirime Puke is waiting for us in the garden. Local people know him as a gifted wood sculptor who knows a lot about Maori culture. We go with Wirime to the vegetable patch. These familiar mounds of earth topped with bunches of greenery remind us of potatoes. Well, these are potatoes, but the sweet ones from New Zealand. In South America, where the sweet potato originated and then spread to the Pacific, they call it batata. And in New Zealand, it's called kumara. Here, kumara is the Maori's daily bread. Indeed, it was the Maori's daily bread. It was stalks of kumara that helped the Maoris survive rainy winters and avoid starvation. Only men had the right to grow kumara. That's why all tribal wars were paused during the kumara planting and harvesting seasons. Otherwise, they'd have starved to death. Of 42 varieties described in 1888, only 7 remain, and they all grow here, under protection.
This is a very special garden in that regard because those particular variety of kumara we have here can't be brought. In fact, there is an ingredient about the sweet potato, or the kumara, that's supposed to aid longevity. And it's an energy food that was used by our war parties.
Legend says that the ancient Maori who set out on a long ocean voyage took kumara with them, but ate it on the way. A brave tribe member returned to Havaiki to fetch new kumara and save the others from starvation. Kumari wasn't all that the Maori grew. They brought other plants from the legendary Havaiki too.
We grew a type of vegetable called a taro, and the leaves were used for wrapping the meat in an earth oven to give it flavour. And it's part of the steaming process. And so the taro that we have here was brought on board the Tainui canoe that made land for this area on the west coast of the Waikato in around about the 1300s.
Anthropologists tried to use plants to trace the Maori's journey, but taro and kumara grow on all Pacific islands. So they failed to find the legendary Havaiki. We didn't expect him to talk about it, but Wirime himself touched on the sensitive subject of the ancient Maori's cannibalism. The occasion was this storehouse, or pataka, in Maori. In ancient times, such storehouses were in the center of each village and demonstrated the chief's status. The chief's personal belongings and sacred insignia were also stored in the pataka, and the flesh of defeated enemies.
The flesh of the enemy was highly prized, so they were preserved in a calabash. And the original storehouse that bears the name that this one is named after stood further downriver. So in order to remember the history, we revived that history. It's not used for storing human flesh.
There were even cases of cannibalism in the 1800s. There's a theory that it was because protein-rich food was scarce, and another that the cannibalism had ritualistic roots. The Maori ate their defeated enemies' flesh to take their strength and humiliate them. They also made whistles or ornaments from their bones.
Because Christianity has taught us to be ashamed a lot about the things that our ancestors did, and the inherent fear that we're going to revive these things. We're not. You go to Europe, who's going to put up a guillotine or burn people at the stake? Yeah, who's going to do that in the 21st century? No one. So if we move past the taboo of these discussions, then we can better understand our past.
The Maori came to New Zealand naked and barefoot. They certainly had ropes, baskets and primitive clothing, but all that soon deteriorated or broke. The Maori had to set up new homes from scratch, find suitable materials and learn how to use them. That's where plants came to the rescue. The New Zealand flax, or harakiki, is an amazing plant. Its fiber is extremely strong. It was used to make ropes, nets and baskets. Let's see how they used it. How do you weave, say, a flax basket? Ngarangoa Lentfer will share her secrets. The process has been worked out to the last detail. First, she cuts several flax leaves, then uses a shell to remove the pulp to reveal the fibers hidden inside.
So this is muka. Muka is the fiber that's you can find in different varieties of harakiki. Yeah. So I have to divide it because it's too thick at one end and it's very thin at the other. Let's see.
Ngarangoa compresses the fiber by rolling it against her leg. Then bundles up some threads, holds the knot with her toes and makes a thin rope. Ropes like this can be used to make almost anything, from baskets and boat cables to loincloths and other clothes.
Korowai, they're the cloaks, the Maori cloaks. You've seen any of those yet? You might need 1,000. Those, and then we make the cotton that goes across to sew it together. You need about 500 of those. It's a very long process because you have to wash it, scrub it, whack it to soften it. Yeah. So yeah, you do a whole lot of those in the end.
These days you can buy anything in a supermarket. However, this ancient craft is still in demand. Tourists are keen to buy flax souvenirs, and Ngarangoa teaches Maori women how to make them.
So I've been weaving for about 25 years. I got into weaving because I lost a baby and I got quite depressed and someone suggested that I might find this quite healing. So yeah, and I've been teaching it for 20 years as well, yep. So yeah.
The Iron Age only began in New Zealand with the arrival of Europeans. Before that, the Maori made tools and weapons from stone. Whiramo is the only woodcarver in New Zealand to use stone tools that he's made himself.
The use of these tools have been virtually extinct since the introduction of metal tools. So in that regard, this being able to do this, it gives me an insight into how those early ancestors used the technology. And I found it very, very sophisticated. We weren't by any means a primitive culture, because there's no mineral resources in New Zealand to develop a steel culture.
Viramo is making a patu onua, or hand club. He's been working on it for several months. Perfection takes time.
These were very efficient killing weapons. It was, these were used primarily to split the skull. And, but these types of objects are highly revered in Maori culture. They often are displayed during funerals, laid on the coffin of the deceased.
The club isn't quite ready, but Viramo shows us what it will look like.
Have we got plenty of daylight time yet?
He takes a semi-finished stone and attaches it to the wooden handle with a flax rope. For Viramo, this is a special piece of work. He wants it to become a family heirloom, to be handed down from generation to generation, to keep the ancient art alive. This stone chisel is ready. Viramo uses it to carve a wooden manaya.
Gotta be careful not to rip it out too much, so I stop halfway. And a grease blade chisel, when properly sharpened, and it does depend on the wood too, it's cuts very similar to a steel chisel, but it can have a tendency to chip. I'll probably just use a basic 4 or 5 chisels just while I'm in the mood, but they require constant sharpening. So you're having someone else nearby rotating and sharpening and handing them over, so that's kind of done in that method, in that way of it knocks down, it quickens the time.
Of course, working with modern tools is easier, but if you want to know how your ancestors lived, you have to do what they did.
But I value the tradition of both metal tools and stone tools. But to have the experience of stone tools, I believe you connect a lot more deeply.
The Maori used the same stone, rope and wood-based technology for all fighting and hunting needs. Unlike other Polynesians, they had no bows or throwing weapons, but favoured spears, axes and the taiaha, a close combat weapon somewhere between a sword and a club. To foreigners, the Maori are one and the same people. However, in ancient times, each tribe lived separately and believed all others to be enemies, and waged endless war against each other. They fought for territory, resources, and the right to live on this hard-gained land. After a few laps around Auckland Bay, our ancient canoe returns to port. The trip took us 2 or 3 hours. How long did it take the ancient Maori to reach New Zealand? Where had they originally come from? If we take a look at the map of the Pacific, we see that the closest land to New Zealand is the Cook Island. Most anthropologists believe that they were the starting point for the Maori on their way to New Zealand. There are almost 3,000 kilometers between New Zealand and the Cook Islands. How could the Maori, in their tiny Polynesian boats, have covered such a vast distance? The Maori themselves think it's quite possible.
On this waka we have encountered waves
higher than the masts. At the moment our masts sit 14 to 15 metres above the waterline, so there has been waves higher than that, and with that size waves and that kind of weather, wind to match, so it is in a sense very tricky, very dangerous when we are out there, but the design of the waka has been two hulls, very stable.
Practice too shows that such a long voyage is possible. In 1992, Te Atorangi took part in sailing a canoe from New Zealand to the Cook Islands.
When I was at school, I was taught that our ancestors, our Polynesian Maori ancestors, were nothing but accidental drifters. That they went out fishing and the wind would catch them out, or they would get caught in a storm and they would drift and drift and drift and then bang into places like New Zealand or the other islands around the Pacific. Well, we know now that that's absolutely wrong, and that our ancestors were great migrating seafarers, and that they were doing this thousands of years before Europeans.
And by us being able to build canoes like this and sail from here across thousands of miles of ocean to another island and back, and not use modern day instruments and equipment, makes our history and traditions change from myth and legend to reality.
We now have a reference point, the Cook Islands. However, it wasn't the initial one. Today, anthropologists know that the point of origin for all Polynesian languages was the island of Taiwan, formerly known as Formosa. It's highly probably the place from which ancient Polynesians began to move eastwards, soon occupying all of the Pacific Islands. Which island, though, was the Maori's point of origin? Which is the legendary Havaiki? Sadly, we'll never know. The ancient Maori may have given that name to each new island along their journey, which is why Havaiki has no exact address. They set out on their long journey fearlessly. They crossed the ocean and found a new homeland at the end of the world. Historians often view the Maori as a primitive tribe, but their remarkable migration reveals exceptional strength and courage. The Maori didn't just manage to settle in a new land, but they also established a distinctive and vibrant culture, so different from other Polynesian nations.